So I need to issue an apology to my mom. Dawn, if you're listening, and I know you are, I'm sorry for saying Jesus Christ so much. So from this day forward, anytime I say Jesus Christ, I will bleep it just for you.
Oh, you got in trouble.
Yeah, but your mouth, it was nothing compared to
I don't even
your
know what you're talking
mouth.
about. I don't
So,
even know what you're talking about.
also, I was not able to take a picture of my intercom in my old bedroom, so Dawn took it for me.
Let's see it.
I can't. It's in the list episode.
Oh, that's right.
But
All
so she
right.
gets prop master credit on that episode. And Jesus is it a good picture?
Ooh.
33, 1, 0. Main event of the evening. Thursday and half past the hour.
It's Tuesday, and you're listening to Murder Unscripted.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Murder Unscripted. I'm your host, Ed Hydock, along with my co-host, Melissa Spivey, Melissapedia.
Oh, hell yeah. I like that.
Like that?
And I just got done promising I wouldn't curse and said hell. My bad, Dawn. My bad.
That took, what, 3 seconds?
Oops.
We are knee-deep into spooky season at this point, and also knee-deep into Block 5, which we are calling Hollywood Horror, because we are covering different true crime cases that either inspired or were inspired by a film or movie. And we wanted to feature some Halloween-themed cases to add to your watch list during spooky season. So last week, Melissa, you told us the awesome case about the List family murders, and awesome meaning the case is incredible, and what happened was not awesome by any means, you know. And that was loosely inspired, I should say, by the 1989 film The Stepfather. And as much as I'd love to sit here and chat about that kind of stuff, we should probably jump right into today's case. So, Melissa, what do you got?
All right. So for today's case, I really leaned into like how one thing inspires another. You'll love this. And this episode was inspired by my real bestie, not you.
Who?
Your dog, Gil.
Yeah, you guys are best. You guys are besties.
Exactly. I'm not covering like Cujo or like a dark web episode of Bluey.
Yeah, he's more.
But can you explain to everyone like what breed of dog that Gil is?
He's a healer, a blue healer.
Or
Australian cattle dog.
Ding, 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 ding.
Are we going down under?
We are.
The thunder from down under.
That's Gil.
Oh, man.
So we're dedicating this episode to my best mate, Gil, and his homeland.
Excellent.
I said mate. See? I got this. This is the beautiful country of Australia. And I feel like Australia has some seriously wild cases, like the case of the Beaumont children, which will forever haunt me. If I had a magic genie and I had 3 wishes, solving that case would be like the first one. But
haunting is an understatement. That one is a terrifying case.
Wild. And another case from Australia that's just horrific is the case of Anita Kobe, which I might cover at some point, but that is a really, really rough one.
I don't know that one.
Oh, it's really rough. So, but one of the most famous Australian cases is that of serial killer Ivan Milat. And he actually partially was the inspiration for the 2005 film Wolf Creek, which is a horror movie. And I'm not actually going to cover Ivan Milat today. He's been covered in a lot of the big true crime pods. So while researching, I found out that there was actually another murderer who is said to be like the inspiration for the Wolf Creek movie. And his name is Bradley John Murdoch.
Well, I'm sure this story is incredible because you present nothing but awesome stories. My absolute favorite Aussie story ever. Do you know a guy named Ned Kelly?
No.
And Ed Kelly was he was like a bush ranger, I guess they call him in Australia, but he was in the late 1800s. He was this dude who was out for vengeance. I'm not going to talk about his case, but he starts this gang. And the final scene of the movie, this is based on a true story. They go out in a blaze of glory where they trade gunfire with police, and they're in this shed, and they come out in armor made of lawnmower parts. And they start, and they're taking bullets from police, and the police end up shooting their legs because they forgot to cover their legs. But I've never actually heard of Bradley John Murdoch, so I'm sorry.
Well, that's why you're so lucky to have me. Someone to like keep you in the know about infamous serial killers. I have no idea what you're bringing to the friendship, but you're welcome nonetheless.
Are you kidding me? Stability, level-headedness, creativity, reliable transportation, snacks, beauty, brains. Should I go on?
Snacks, yes, but beauty, absolutely not. Anyway, I'm not surprised you aren't familiar with Bradley John Murdoch. Honestly, I had heard the name, but like I wasn't super familiar with him or the case until I was researching for this block. And well, thankfully, like his known kill count isn't super high. He does have one confirmed victim. He is a foul, horrific human being, and his poor victim, Peter Falconio, I think he needs to have his story told. But before we get to Peter, I want to tell you about like the film that was inspired by both Ivan Milat and Bradley John Murdoch. So,
cool.
Yeah, I mentioned you like horror movies, so you would probably be into this. Yeah. So Wolf Creek is a horror movie. It was released in 2005, and it kind of got mixed reviews from critics. Like, a few critics weren't down with the extreme depictions of violence, which I get. I'm not a big fan of like the whole torture porn kind of horror movie. Like,
oh, the irony.
I know.
Well,
Wolf Creek is about three friends, two British tourists, Christy and Liz, and their Australian friend Ben. And this trio, they're backpacking across Australia, they're partying, they're just like out there living their best 20-something-year-old lives. So they buy a junky car, they start traveling, driving across the country, and they're in Wolf Creek National Park. And after a few days of exploring, they get back to their camp and, shocker, their car won't start.
Has any car in any horror movie ever started? Like,
no.
I feel like cars don't start in horror movies unless they're like, you crank the key for like 10 seconds. They're like, come on. And then it starts.
Well, you pretty much just, spoiler alert, gave the rest of the movie. But you know what? Their car didn't start, but fear not, because there is a, air quotes, helpful local gentleman that just comes across them, casually. And he's like, I'm going to tow your car. And you know what? You guys can stay at my place for the night. But he said it with an Australian accent.
Can you say it with an Australian accent, please?
Nope. So the girls, Liz and Christy, they're like, that's probably a bad idea. But Ben's not worried. He's like, yep, we'll go to your place. You can fix my car. Cool. And this guy, this helpful stranger, his name is Mick Taylor. And of course, Mick takes them to like his home in a super rural area. And it's like, no one's around, super desolate. It's by an abandoned mining site. And, it's a horror movie. So he's not going to be like, come on over to my townhouse with lots of neighbors and people who can see that I have guests and there's nothing shady going around.
Plenty of places like this all over the outback. Thousands of them.
It's no Breeze Knoll. It's
yeah.
Exactly. it's a cabin in the woods. It's always a cabin in the woods.
Always. So Mick starts working on their broken down car, and he offers the three friends something to drink, which we later find out was laced with something, and everybody's unconscious. So Liz wakes up the next day, and she's like bound in a shed, and Liz in the audience can hear that Christy is like somewhere off screen being tortured, and you kind of assume she's being sexually assaulted, and we have no idea where Ben is, but Liz is somehow able to get out of her bindings, and she actually finds like their car that Mick was supposedly fixing, and she sets it on fire and like hoping to distract Mick from whatever he's doing to Christy, and it works. So Mick's putting out the fire, Liz gets Christy, she finds Mick's gun, because of course he just left it laying out.
Of course, yeah.
So she actually shoots him and he goes down, and we're all like, whoop, he's dead. So the girls steal one of the random cars on Mick's property and they attempt to flee. But shocker, Mick was not actually dead. And he starts shooting at the girls and at the car. And Liz and Christy still manage to flee, but like Mick is hot on their tail in like another vehicle. And again, there's just all these random cars like on the property.
They're all. Do any of them start? They all just have like half drained. They're all just there's 10 of your cars.
Exactly. Somehow the girls like send this car over a cliff and they hide from Mick because he thinks they were in the car that went over the cliff.
Smart.
So they sneak back to Mick's property because like they need to find another car to get out of there. And they're like, where is Ben? So Liz goes to find a car in Mick's garage and she leaves Christy. And Christy is just like beside herself, like just a mess, of course. But so she leaves Christy outside and she's like, if I'm not back in 5 minutes, you need to save yourself. Leave me here and I want you to run. So Liz goes in this garage and she finds all these cars and she also finds a ton of like random belongings, backpacks, just random items. And there's a bunch of cameras and video cameras, including one that belonged to Ben. So Liz is like looking at all these cameras and all this stuff and she suddenly realizes these are all other tourist items. This guy is a madman. And she also realizes, like, he set up the situation, like, just coming across them, like, he broke their car. So she starts looking at some of the footage on Ben's camera, and she realizes that while they had been driving and, like, having fun in the car, Mick's car was, like, casually behind them. So, like, he had been following them. So she rushes to get in one of the cars when she puts all this together, and Mick is hiding in the back seat. And this is one of the parts I skipped, but it's super brutal. And Mick tortures and murders Liz.
You're like, something happens. I know it does.
It does, but I'm not telling you what. It's
I don't know
too
what.
scary.
I'm not going to reveal it because I don't know it.
Too scary.
I feel like this plot twist has been in other movies, which I love it every time. I mean, it's so played out, but it's I don't know. It's like a classic horror movie storyline.
It always throws me off when like the final, who you think is going to be the final girl dies. Because then I'm like, what is happening? Like, what is going on? Like, it always throws me off.
Yeah.
So meanwhile, Christy had taken off and she finally makes it to a major road. She flags down a driver. The driver's like, oh my God, gets out of the car, stops and helps her. Suddenly he's shot dead. It was Mick with a sniper rifle. So Christy like jumps in the guy's car, tries to flee, car flips. She's like dragging herself out of the vehicle. Mick shoots and kills her. He puts her body and the Good Samaritan guy who pulled over, puts both their bodies in the car and he sets it on fire. So this whole time, like, we still have no idea where Ben is, but we finally see him and he's like nailed to a board and he's in a mine shaft.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So he's somehow able to get away, but he passes out like in the outback along a dirt road. Finally, he's found by passing tourists and they get him help. He's flown to a hospital. He recovers, but then suddenly everyone suspects Ben of murdering Liz and Christy.
Sure.
He is eventually cleared, but the audience, like on cards at the end of the film, we find out that the bodies of Christy and Liz had never been found. And the investigation is kind of messed up from the start, which is kind of interesting because of how like the real life case that I'm going to tell you about plays out. And then the movie ends with Mick walking towards the sunset in the Australian outback while carrying a big ass shotgun, which then leads to more murderous hijinks in the Wolf Creek sequel, which was released in 2013. And it was the same actor who played Mick in the first one and the second one.
I don't know if hijinks is the word I'd use, but like hijinks, I feel like taping an air horn under somebody's office chair and so it like goes off when they sit down. That's like hijinks. This is more. I get what you're saying.
Tomato.
The actor. It's funny you say that. The actor who played Mick, John Jarrett is his name. I think he was perfectly cast because he had that creep factor. Fantastic villain and like an unsuspecting villain. He didn't star in a whole lot of movies, but fun fact, he did. This is why I just thought of this. He actually played Ned Kelly in an old miniseries called The Last Outlaw.
Really?
Yeah, which that's how when I was talking about Ned Kelly, I'm like, oh my God, this Wolf Creek, this John Jarrett also played him in a miniseries about Ned Kelly. So check it out if you're into 1970 miniseries.
Look at us tying more things together.
Man.
So As I mentioned, Wolf Creek was inspired by not one, but two real-life murderers who just absolutely terrorized the Australian outback, Ivan Milat and Bradley John Murdoch. And the latter, Bradley John Murdoch, is our topic of conversation today. More specifically, the murder of Peter Falconio, and we'll also talk about the survival of Peter's girlfriend, Joanne Lees. So, throwback to our last block, I'm a survivor.
Yep, absolutely.
And we're actually going to have, spoiler alert, we're actually going to have another throwback to our No Corpus Delicti block, which was the first block of Murder Unscripted.
Man,
But
throwback central.
I know, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So let's talk about Peter and Joanne. So our story takes place in July of 2001 in Australia. And at the time, Peter was 29 years old and Joanne was 28. And they were British tourists who had met in actually 1996. They met at a nightclub and they had been dating ever since. And I got the impression that this may have been when maybe on this trip, Peter was going to propose. I don't know. And unfortunately, we don't get that far. But yeah. Peter Marco Falconio, he was born on September 20th, 1972 to Joan and Luciano Falconio. And he grew up as the third of four boys in Hepsworth, West Yorkshire, England, which is 4 hours or so north of London, according to Google Maps. So if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. I couldn't find a whole bunch about Peter's childhood, but I know that he did go on to study and graduate from Brighton University at the Brighton campus, which is about 2 hours south of London on the southern coast of England.
Okay.
So Peter and Joanne had been living together in this area, specifically in Hove, prior to their big holiday in Australia. And this couple loved to travel and see the world. They had been so many places. So they were very well traveled and they just loved going on adventures and they loved doing it together.
Nice.
So our survivor, yay, Joanne Rachel Lees was born on September 23rd, 1973, and her parents were divorced when she was young, so she lived with her mom, Jenny, and when she was, I believe, 11 years old, she and her mother moved in with her mom's new husband, Vincent, and his son, Sam, and they lived in Huddersfield, Yorkshire, England, which I believe was 30 minutes away from Peter's hometown, and again, UK listeners, if I'm wrong, tell me.
I'm not going to lie. As excited as I was about the block that we're doing for Spooky Movie Connections, I am more excited to hear when you told me you were doing an Australian case that had ties to England as well, because I've heard you pronounce the word zealot, and I am dying to hear you pronounce everything in this episode. I cannot wait.
Which one is it?
It's zealot. It's zealot.
I forgot. Anyway, I listened to pronunciations. Thank you. So Huddersfield is actually where the nightclub was that Peter and Joanne met. And after a year or so of dating, Joanne moved south to Hove, where he had been going to school. So that way then they could live together. So as I mentioned, Joanne and Peter loved to travel. They had already been to a ton of places. They had been to Italy and Greece. They'd gone to Jamaica. And now in November of 2000, they were leaving to embark on their next huge adventure. They had plans to visit a ton of places, including Nepal, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, New Zealand, and Australia. So fast forward to January 16th, 2001, they finally land in Australia. They're in Sydney. And their plan is to stay and work in Sydney for a few months and to save up some money to then travel across Australia before ending their holiday and returning home.
That sounds super dangerous, if you ask me. But maybe I'm just picturing you and I hiking through Australia, and I think feeding random koalas, which they're nasty from what I hear. They don't just eat eucalyptus; they eat human beings.
I think we need a fact checker. So they're in Sydney. Peter got a job installing office furniture and Joanne was working at a bookstore. And by June, they'd really saved up enough money to start their adventure across the country. So on June 25th, 2001, that is what they did. They departed from Sydney and they were driving because Peter was able to purchase an old bright orange VW bus.
Oh, how Charlie Manson of them.
I know. That's exactly what I thought of. So on June 25th, 2001, they start their journey and they make some friends along the way, actually. They spent most nights, like, they would meet other travelers. They would either sleep in their van or maybe at a campsite. And according to all accounts, things were going really, really well. But unfortunately, we get to Friday, July 14th, and the couple at this point, they had made it to Alice Springs, which is in Australia's Northern Territory, and they kind of just spent the day like running errands. Joanne went to a library, check her email. Peter met with an accountant. There was some issues with paying taxes, like as a tourist with a working visa. So they're in Alice Springs. They do, running errands, and then they later that afternoon they saw some sights. And after 4 p.m., they loaded in the car and they were going to head north on the Stewart Highway towards Darwin. And according to an article in The Guardian, at about 6:30 p.m. that night, the couple stopped to watch the sunset and they got gas at a place called the Tie Tree Roadhouse. And that was like 2 hours north of Alice Springs. So they got some snacks there, they get gas, they get back in the car, they keep driving. And I think that their plan was to just kind of drive until one of them got super tired and they'd switch off and on driving. And
Sure.
But this is where everything went so wrong. So Peter and Joanne are driving Stewart Highway, and the highway is like completely deserted, super isolated. And I heard many people talk about how like you could drive this highway for hours and just not see another person. Soon there's like this SUV 4-wheel drive vehicle that kind of zooms up behind them, and there's a man and his dog in the cab, and the guy is like frantically waving at the couple and pointing to their car. Yeah. But he's like, it looks like he's trying to tell them something's wrong. And Peter is like, okay, something must be wrong. I'm going to pull over. And Joanne's like, heck no, you're not. We are not pulling over. It's desolate. It's so dark. We're in the middle of nowhere. And this is around 7:30-ish at night, and like we know it's dark because they had watched the sunset together an hour prior to this. And there's no lights anywhere. Like, it is dark. And Joanne is obviously not a fan of pulling over, but Peter was really concerned that something was genuinely wrong with the car. They had been at the mechanic earlier that day or in the past couple days.
I am 100% with Joanne on this one. Like, there is no chance that I'm pulling over for someone waving at me on a desolate road. And I don't know. I would wait till I got to like a Wawa or something well lit, personally.
You know what? I hear there's plenty of Wawas in the Australian outback.
What do they got to have something similar.
Tie trees. What?
Tie tree roadhouses.
Well, all right, hold on. Let's pause for a second, like actually think about this, because I feel like Peter and Joanne get hate for this decision, and I don't think it's fair, because I honestly don't know what I would do. I don't think I'd pull over if I was alone, but like, I am terrible at car stuff. How long did I drive around with a flat tire and like someone had to stop me and be like, ma'am, that is flat. Like, it was bad.
Melissa, the tire that you showed me wasn't just shredded. Do you still have a picture of you took one to send to somebody when I was changing your tire? I need you to send me that picture because I'm going to put it up so everyone can see what I saw. I was astounded. And if this happened in the Australian outback where one of those carnivorous koalas live, those human eating koalas, like,
I don't know. I mean, we can sit here and say, why the hell would he pull over? But like, we weren't there. None of us know what we would do. And in his defense, they had been having like really like problems with the van.
Yeah, I guess.
So, so Peter pulls over, and so does this other car. And the man in the car gets out and tells Peter and Joanne that there's sparks coming from the exhaust pipe. So Peter gets out of the van. He's like, thank you. Thanks for stopping. And Joanne slides over to the driver's seat, and she can hear Peter and the man talking, and they're gesturing towards the exhaust pipe. So Peter comes around. He asks Joanne to rev the engine a couple times. And as she does this, she hears a loud pop. And the first thing she thinks is that it was the car backfiring.
Yeah, backfire.
Right.
Totally.
But then she looks up, and like right at her window, she sees this mystery man standing at her car window with a gun.
Oh, wow. It's Wolf Creek. Literally.
It
Wolf
is.
Creek. It's terrifying.
Yeah. And it's like pretty much determined at this point that the loud pop was a gunshot.
Wow.
And we believe that the man ultimately shot and most likely killed Peter at that point. So we're going to switch gears for just a second. We're going to talk about this mystery man. So if you haven't put two and two together, this man is 43-year-old Bradley John Murdoch. And my goodness, is this guy an absolute piece of crap.
You can say shit. You can say Dawn won't care. You can say shit.
No, I'm not upsetting Dawn.
He already did.
Until I forget. So Bradley John Murdoch was born in Geraldton, Australia on February 19th, 1958 to parents Colin and Nancy Murdoch. And Bradley was the youngest of three boys, and this was an unexpected pregnancy. I know that his parents were like a little bit older when they had him, and his brothers were older. They were like young teenagers when Bradley came along. And according to reports, he did have a pretty, quote unquote normal upbringing, but he did later claim that he kind of felt like an outcast with his family, which if your brothers are 10 years, 11, 12 years older than you, I mean, I kind of can see where he's coming from, but still, like feeling like an outcast. So he grew up in Northampton, Australia, and when he was 13, his family moved from the relatively small town to the city of Perth in Western Australia. And this move did not go well for Bradley. He just could not handle life in the big city, and he fell in with a rough crowd. He joined a biker gang, and
wow.
Yeah, and at 15, he dropped out of school, and he eventually left Perth and moved back to Geraldton, where he was born, and he just continued on a downward spiral fueled by drugs, violence, paranoia, and it was not good. So he worked as a mechanic and eventually started a trucking company at one point, but that later went bankrupt. So his main job was running drugs, and lots of drugs, running, smuggling across the country, across the territories. He was married in 1984, and he actually had a son, I believe, in the following year, but he was horrifically abusive, and the couple separated 2 years later in 1986, and I don't think he really ever had contact with his child again.
Not
Good
surprised.
for the child.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
So, as if the drugs and domestic violence and abandoning your child weren't bad enough, this foul piece of trash was so racist and was reportedly a member of the KKK and other white supremacists.
Wow.
And he absolutely hated Aboriginal people. One source said that he would later claim that this hatred stemmed from his childhood when a group of Aboriginal people beat him up. But
so some bullying, childhood bullying.
I don't believe a word that comes out of his mouth. So take that with a grain of salt,
That's true.
I think he was just a piece of racist white trash. But
it sounds that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really don't have any idea why Bradley John Murdoch was even walking free. When he was 21 years old in 1980, he hit and killed someone on a motorcycle, and he was convicted of causing death by dangerous driving, but he received a suspended sentence. And then, and then, oh my gosh, in August of 1995, this racist piece of shit, he got drunk, and then he started shooting at a group of Aboriginal people. They were celebrating a big football or American soccer game. He served a whopping 15 months of a 21-month sentence.
21 whole months and 15.
Yeah.
Man, it sounds like, you know what, the Australian justice system started to sound a lot like ours, and that's not good.
Seriously. That's why they need help with their punishments, and my phone is not even ringing, and I don't know why.
Death by koala. That's what
I like that one. That's a good one. So we're back to the fateful night of July 14th, 2001, and Joanne is now face to face with this Bradley John Murdoch, who's pointing a gun at her, and he threatens to kill her if she doesn't obey every word. And she's screaming for Peter because she doesn't know where he is. Everything happened so fast. She thought it was a car backfiring. So she's screaming for him. Murdoch grabs her, and he proceeds to tie her hands up behind her back. And he had tried to tie her feet, but she was kicking and struggling so much. That's so badass. He also put a sack over her head, and he throws her in his car. and he leaves her in there with the dog, and he just disappears.
Wow.
So
Crazy.
So Joanne's able to like wiggle out of the sack on her head, and she realizes she's alone with the dog, and she doesn't see Murdoch, she doesn't see Peter, but she's like, this is my chance. I gotta get out of here. And she's able to get out of the car, and she just runs. It is pitch black. You like cannot see your hand in front of your face, pitch black. She's just like running into like the great abyss. And she's tied up with her hands behind her back. She trips and falls a couple of times. But
In true horror movie fashion.
it's just so true.
Yeah, right.
But like she's able to hide in some bushes. And one source was talking about how she's like trying to be silent and like control her breathing. Because remember, it is so silent out there.
Well,
There's nothing. And she could hear Bradley come like back to the car, and he discovered she was gone. So he like searched for her high and low. He's out near her, like super close to her, and she's trying to hold her breath. Like, so he finally, thankfully, gives up and he drives off. But a little while later, he returns and he keeps looking for her. And at one point, this like gives me the chills. He like moved his truck to face the land where he thought Joanne was, and he put on his lights to like light up the whole area.
Oh man, creepy.
Right? I was like reading that, my palms are sweating. But I just like can't even freaking imagine how scary that had to be. And like I know he had his dog, so thankfully the dog didn't like sniff her out.
Yeah, right?
Right? But again, Bradley was thankfully unable to locate Joanne the second time, and eventually he drove off. So poor Joanne stays hidden in the dark, in the bush. It's cold because it's winter in Australia. So she's in the outback for hours until she finally like felt like it was okay to come out of hiding.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So where was Bradley the whole time?
So he put her in the car, and then he left for a little bit, and then she ran away. He went to look for her, and then he left again and then came back. And in those couple times that he like kind of left, they think that he was hiding the VW, like when he moved the VW van, which was later found down the road a little ways.
Oh, wow.
And or hiding Peter's body, maybe.
Oh, right. Okay. That's right, because Peter, we still don't know where he is.
Right. So Joanne's able to like bring her bound hands like under her butt and up above her legs. Like now her hands are in front of her, but she still can't get the bindings off. So around 1 a.m., and this is like 5 hours since Bradley Murdoch originally pulled her and Peter over.
Yeah.
She's able to get to the roadside, and she sees a road train coming. And this is like a tractor trailer.
It's a road train. Yeah, I was going to ask you.
Yes,
road train.
I had to look it up. So it's like a tractor trailer, but not just like one trailer. It has several.
Oh, like
attached.
A literal road train.
Yeah, it's wild. Like how many? So she like dives in front of this road train, and apparently it takes them a really long time to stop.
Well, yeah.
So Vince is able to untie Joanne, and he and his like coworker, they start helping Joanne like look around the area for Peter. But once Vince finds out that like Joanne's attacker had been armed, he's like, all right, I think it's time to go to the police. So they drive Joanne to the closest town, and that's the town of Barrow Creek. And the police are called, but like this entire area is so remote that the police have to travel from Alice Springs, which is like 3 hours south of Barrow Creek. Yeah. So it is far. And again, I just want to like emphasize how desolate and remote this area is. Barrow Creek has a population of 11. 11. So
I feel like there's 11 people in my house at any given time.
That's so true.
God.
Yeah, so it is not like a thriving metropolis with its own police force.
No, it is not.
So the police finally get to Joanne. She tells them everything. And at first, police are like completely at a loss. Like they have absolutely no idea who could have done this. And I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this investigation, it wasn't great. And I actually listened to an Australian-based podcast, and they did an interview with a woman who worked on this case. And she straight up said that the beginning of this investigation was kind of messy and unorganized. And this was Detective Superintendent Colleen Wynn. She was eventually the lead detective on Peter's case, and she talks about getting the phone call from like a colleague about murder, and they had Joanne and like Colleen needed to come in. So Colleen first mentions how like this is not a normal occurrence for her and her team. They don't generally get calls about people being murdered. So right off the bat, I feel like maybe the investigators were in a little bit over their head, which it happens. Like,
we see this too in small town American cities where these things don't happen here, but when they do, the police force is either underprepared for it because they've never had to deal with it. So maybe they don't have the tools or the manpower. So I imagine it's a pretty chaotic atmosphere for them.
for sure. And Colleen Wynn said in her interview, quote, "I think those first 24 hours were critical and probably did a lot more damage than we originally understood," end quote. And
No doubt.
Well, and in the context of this interview, she meant that like the investigators didn't originally realize or plan for this investigation to go on for years, which it ultimately did. So police hear Joanne's story and they sent officers out to where the crime scene was, like, and actually our MU MVP Vince Miller goes with them. So to like kind of show them exactly where everything happened. And they got there at about 7 a.m. And eventually they find the VW van, which was like down the road from the crime scene and kind of hidden in the bush. They also find blood on the ground, and it's clear that someone tried to cover this pool of blood up with dirt. But
wow.
At this point, they're still like, they still think Peter is alive because Joanne never saw him after he had gotten out of the car. And the amount of blood that they found, like, it wasn't enough for them to say whoever lost this blood couldn't survive.
Right.
So a huge manhunt begins, and they also put out roadblocks. But it wasn't until about 8 hours that these roadblocks went out, like after Joanne was found.
8 hours is a long ass time. I mean, in the grand scheme,
Yes.
Especially if the killer, if he wanted to get out of town. I mean, he had an 8-hour head start, and not to mention Peter. Both of them could literally be anywhere at this point.
Exactly. And actually another resource that the police use, which I think is really freaking cool, but they brought in Aboriginal trackers, and like these people are just so,
wow.
Right?
Could you imagine if Bradley, you know how much he hated Aborigines? Could you imagine if these Aboriginal trackers caught him? So he was actually captured by the people he hated. Oh my God.
Karma. My favorite kind of karma.
Yep.
Well, I just think this is such an awesome resource because these people just know the landscape so well that they're able to identify even like the slightest, smallest disruption to the land. And they're also able to tell where a person may have been and like what direction they may have gone in. Unfortunately, nothing came from this. So the investigation's kicking off. And of course, this means that the police are questioning Joanne over and over and over again. And this is where the tables sort of turn. Police begin suspecting that maybe Joanne is involved in Peter's disappearance.
What?
And well, this is tough. I can kind of see where they're coming from, but I 100% see where Joanne's coming from. So they don't really believe Joanne's story about how the night went. And as she's telling her story over and over again, there's certain discrepancies that police are zeroing in on. And I understand that it could seem suspicious, so I wanted to like talk it out a little bit. But in the last day or so, this woman went from being on literally like the vacation, the holiday of a lifetime with her boyfriend. Everything's going great. And suddenly her world is just shattered by this maniac. Peter's gone. He attempted to kidnap and assault Joanne.
Wow.
I'm sure she is exhausted. She's confused. She's devastated. The road train driver who found her and the police, they believe she was in shock, from what she went through. And she's in a foreign country. She's absolutely no support from family or friends. And she also isn't given any support like counseling or even real medical treatment, like right at first.
Wow.
So police are not only worried about her story, but just like we've heard 1,000 times before, the police didn't like Joanne's demeanor.
You really are scaring me. You think I did this, don't you?
No, but I have to ask if you've been involved.
No, I haven't been involved. Not at all. Not.
she wasn't acting how they felt a victim should act.
Mm-hmm.
And, between that and these discrepancies, it's just not helping. One example, so when Joanne described her attacker's dog, she then later described the dog differently, but again, after everything she went through, I'm sure she wasn't thinking clearly. And in the moment of seeing this dog, she's worried about Peter and about her own survival, not if her attacker has a Chihuahua or a Yorkie.
Yeah, you're fighting for your life, not thinking about did the dog have a rhinestone collar on, or was it
Exactly. And so she had also originally said her attacker had a baseball cap on, but then later she said she didn't know if he wore a hat.
those little things can doom you if you're a suspect,
Yes.
those little inconsistencies. I get it.
And then there's a discrepancy about how she managed to get from the front of her attacker's car to the back to then escape. And however she described it, the cops were like, the make and model of the car you described, that's not possible.
Did you notice we got an awesome comment on Shannon's interview on YouTube from Detective Miller himself, and he said to her, "Your story never changed one bit from the first time I ever talked to you," and that was why he believed her.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is so hard because I can see why they had to look at her, but I also don't feel like they had a whole lot of experience dealing with a clearly traumatized victim.
Trauma is a funny thing. I mean, I'm surprised she remembered much of anything, to be honest, given what she went through.
I can see both sides. So things are just getting worse for Joanne over the next few weeks because she's suddenly being hounded by the media. And for all the reasons I just went through, about her being in shock and not receiving proper trauma counseling, the media didn't like Joanne's demeanor. They begin to twist the narrative, and suddenly they're kind of against her. And no one from law enforcement gave Joanne any sort of guidance or help dealing with the media. So she wasn't prepared for being thrust into the spotlight during what is probably the most stressful and confusing and horrific time in her young life. She's in her late 20s. She had never been in this situation.
Right.
And
it's like Richard Jewell.
And Lindy Chamberlain, another Australian. Yes. And then the media and the public felt like Joanne wasn't acting the way they wanted her to. She was either too calm and cool and collected. But then on the flip side, if she showed too much emotion, they accused her of having crocodile tears. So I'm
well, how do you want me to act?
Right. This girl just could not win. So during the beginning of the investigation, police are looking at CCTV footage, and they do find surveillance of a man with a vehicle similar to what Joanne described at a gas station shortly after the attack, but the footage is super grainy. And eventually they do release this footage to the public, and they're hoping that the person in the video would come forward to clear themselves, but that didn't happen. So they start looking at the car in the video, and they can tell it's a 4-wheel drive Toyota Land Cruiser. So they start focus on pulling the records of all registered 4-wheel drive Toyota Land Cruisers from 1991 to 1999. So that's a significant chunk of records to go through. So this,
a lot of vehicles,
this takes a while. But keep in mind, in the background of the investigation, while they're working on these vehicle records, they do have other evidence which had been sent to the lab. And after a few weeks, the lab sends the results back to the police, and they found the DNA profile of an unknown male. It wasn't Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And this DNA was on the gear shift of the VW. Oh, and it was also on the zip tie handcuffs that Joanne had been bound with.
Oh, wow.
And it's also on Joanne's shirt.
That evidence had to get the public off her back, because it's okay, now we believe you. Now the evidence is staring you in the face.
Yes, it definitely helped.
This story, this actually happened to you.
Right. It helped, but, there had already been such a breakdown in, goodwill towards the police and the media. So.
Okay.
But here's the problem. The DNA, it doesn't match anyone in the system. So they have the DNA, but they don't know who it goes to. So they go back to the video from the gas station with the man and the Toyota Land Cruiser. and they release that footage to the public, and they get a ton of tips, and one of these tips leads them to Bradley Murdoch.
Excellent.
So we're getting there.
Yeah.
So in November of 2001, so this is now like 4 months after the attack on Joanne and the disappearance of Peter, investigators interview Murdoch, but nothing really comes of this. The only real tie at this point is that he has a similar car to what Joanne described, but like, so do a ton of other people.
Right.
Yeah. And so this isn't a smoking gun by any means. And they aren't able to hold him for anything. And they aren't able to get his DNA because like they just didn't have enough reasonable cause, I guess.
But he had to be the prime suspect at this point, right?
Not really, because here's the thing. The footage was so grainy, and the description of him that Joanne had given wasn't quite perfect to what the grainy guy looked. Yeah. So, all right. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit to February of 2002. And this is when Colleen Wynn, who I mentioned earlier, she gets put in charge of Peter and Joanne's case. And Joanne had stayed in Australia until like the end of 2001, but eventually, you know, she did have to go back to the UK and figure out her life and like a new normal. So with Colleen taking over the investigation, this is like a turning point because at this point, like I just mentioned, the relationship between Joanne and the Australian authorities had soured, and the relationship between Joanne and the media and the public had definitely soured. But when Colleen took over, she was able to talk to Joanne and like get on better terms.
Does this have like Shannon Myers Barrientos and Lieutenant Miller vibes or what? Like,
yes.
Yeah, I feel like Colleen was the first person who like listened to her and said, I believe you. This woman is telling the truth.
Exactly. Like she just like listened to her description of things and everything. And she was just like, you were telling the truth. This genuinely happened to you.
Right. Good.
So now in May of 2002, police arrest a drug runner smuggler, and his name is James Heppy. And this guy, probably in an attempt to save his own butt, he starts telling police about Bradley Murdoch and his connection to Peter and Joanne and Peter's murder. So apparently James and Murdoch had worked together at one point running drugs, but they had had a falling out. I guess James was like, he is not my friend anymore, and felt no allegiance to his former friend. Exactly. Because he just like squeals and tells police how when, you know, he saw Murdoch, like shortly after everything happened with Peter and Joanne, Murdoch had drastically changed his appearance. He had shaved off his facial hair, he'd cut his hair, and he changed the appearance of the Toyota Land Cruiser. And remember,
he was a mechanic.
Yes. So it would have been like super easy for him to like change his vehicle. And the back of this, they called it a ute in all the Australian papers.
Yeah, I know.
UTE. Yeah. Well, it had like a canvas covering, like how Jeeps have.
Oh, like a soft top.
Yes.
Like mine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, now that canvas covering was like a different color than the one in there, right? Like than what was in the original security footage from that gas station. And this James Heppy guy also said that Murdoch seemed very agitated and like really paranoid when James had seen him in the weeks after the attack on Joanne and Peter. And I'm sure like this is all true, but you know, keep in mind that Murdoch and this James Heppy guy consumed massive amounts of amphetamines to keep themselves awake for hours on end to complete their drug runs.
Wow.
So I'm willing to bet that added to this chaotic demeanor.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. So James Heppy also told police how Murdoch would like talk about burying bodies in the outback and where he would hypothetically bury a body. And apparently, like shortly before the attack on Peter and Joanne, Heppy and Murdoch had been like talking, and Murdoch was making handcuffs out of like cable zip ties.
Why can't these guys, one, keep their mouth shut, and two, just be normal? I guess because they're not normal. That's the only way that, But like,
So remember, Joanne was bound with zip tie cable ties. So now police have a name, and this name matches the tip they had gotten months ago. So they now want to compare the DNA that they have, but they're like super afraid that Murdoch's going to flee.
Yeah.
I love this part. They actually go to his brother, and I guess that they explain the situation. And the brother, who Bradley had a falling out with, the brother's like, I got you. Here you go. Take whatever you want. And he gives his DNA.
Another scorned friend.
If you're going to commit murders, man, don't be crossing people. They're going to
That's
snitch
true.
you out.
We got one of those. I think she just left a 1-star review.
Oh, yeah. That's so true. So now we're in August of 2002, and Bradley Murdoch is basically missing. Police don't really know where he is. But it turns out he's staying with a male friend of his, this friend's 33-year-old girlfriend, and the girlfriend's 12-year-old daughter. And the friend wasn't actually around because he was in the hospital. He was being treated for cancer.
Oh, wow.
So Murdoch is staying on this property. He's in the guest house, and Murdoch's continuing to be a heavy drug user at this time, including lots and lots of amphetamines. And it seems like he's just becoming more and more paranoid about police finding him. But we've talked about this before. Instead of trying to be on his best behavior and fly under the radar, this shitbag ends up luring. Sorry, Don. Okay, when you hear what he does, you'll agree. But he ends up luring the 12-year-old girl into the guest house, where he ties her up with zip ties. He puts tape over her mouth and he blindfolds her. Trigger warning. He proceeds to rape this little girl multiple times. So
it's zip ties, duct tape. They all have them. They're rape kits. They're called.
Yes. Yep.
They all make them. Yep. And they always have zip ties and duct tape.
Always. So he then carries this girl to his car, and then he goes inside to get her mom. And remember, that's a girlfriend of his friend. So he gets the woman to his car, where he ties her up as well. And according to The Guardian, Murdoch tells him that he needs them as, quote, insurance, end quote. And then he drives away. He drives with the kidnapped mother and daughter for 25 hours.
What?
He stopped a few times here and there, but I'm not quite sure what his plan was, other than to maybe use the mother and daughter as hostages if the police
I was
caught
gonna
up
say
with him.
it could be like ransom.
But here's the weirdest, craziest part. After this insane 24-hour drive from hell, he drops the mother and daughter off at a gas station and gives them $1,000.
And gave them money? Why take them in the first place?
And get this, he actually tells them that they could probably sell their story of him kidnapping and assaulting them to the media and make money.
He's giving them business tips. Man, this had 100% had to be some kind of drug-induced psychosis. What else would it be?
And I think that the drugs led to paranoia, which led to him freaking out that the cops were just after him, and it just turned into So he drops off the mother and the daughter, and he is later arrested. After he was arrested and authorities are searching his car, he had an obscene amount of weapons and ammo. I think I read something 800 rounds of ammo.
Wow.
Yeah, he had chains in his car. He had a cattle prod. Man. He had night vision goggles, a wild amount of crazy stuff that nobody needs in their car.
Right.
And they also they at one point find a hair tie that was identified as belonging to Joanne. And they found a t-shirt that had belonged to Peter.
There's your smoking gun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in October of 2002, he was named as a suspect in the murder of Peter Falconio, which...
You think after all that?
Right. Well, here's our throwback to Block 1, no corpus delicti. They didn't have Peter's body.
They didn't have his body. I never even thought about that he hasn't actually been found yet. I glossed over that. Wow.
And to this day, September of 2024, his body has still never been found.
Crazy.
So when Murdoch was named as a suspect, Joanne saw a picture of Murdoch online, with the caption, suspect in backpack,
Mm-hmm.
And she looks at it and she's like, that is him 100%. And this would come up later in court because even though Joanne ID'd Murdoch when like police showed her the photo lineup, his attorney was trying to say that this identification was tainted because she had already seen his picture online with the caption saying he was the suspect.
Or, like, hear me out, maybe she ID'd him because it was the attacker. It was the guy who
Wild.
attacked her. Crazy theory.
Right.
God.
We just talked about this like defense attorneys, and
Yes.
I know you gotta do your job,
But damn.
wow.
Yeah.
So Murdoch is put on trial for the rape and the kidnapping of the 12-year-old girl and her mother. And during this trial, he claimed that he had fled because the police were trying to frame him for Peter's murder. But get this, he was later acquitted of all charges relating to the rape and kidnapping. And I don't know why. Like, I tried looking it up. Like, one source mentioned that the mother and daughter had not reported the kidnapping and assault right away, which, like, I feel like that's bullshit.
Wow. So there must not have been enough evidence to prove it.
I guess. But
still, that sucks.
Basically, immediately after he was acquitted, he was arrested and charged for the murder, assault, and attempted abduction of Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees.
Good. And hopefully that mother and daughter took that. Yes, it's not justice for them, but it's this guy got it. That trumps what they went through. So like
Yes.
now, you know what I mean? So hopefully that in their minds was vengeance enough.
I hope so.
Yeah.
So this trial begins in October of 2005. Murdoch enters a non-guilty plea. The prosecution, his name was Rex. I think it was Rex Wild.
That's like, awesome. What a great name.
I love it. Yeah.
He could be anything. He could be a lawyer, a wrestler, a porn star, a cowboy.
A cowboy porn star, whatever. So
good eye, mate. Whoa, Rex.
Whoa. There's
Rex
the
Wild.
thunder from down under.
I'm Rex Wild.
Moving on. The prosecution relied heavily on the DNA evidence, but it should be noted that the DNA profile on the gear shift of the car ended up like determining as inconclusive. The defense's argument was about that photo identification, which I mentioned earlier, tainted, blah, blah, blah.
That's his only defense, is it wasn't me. So you got the wrong guy. Yeah.
He also brought up the inconsistencies in Joanne's recollections of the night, but the prosecutor like did a really good job of like shutting that down because he reminded the court and the jury that Joanne had been through hell. Yes. And of course, this is going to mess with her memory and what she noticed.
Absolutely. Did they ever give a motive though?
So yes, the prosecutor hypothesized a few things. Like maybe Murdoch had seen Joanne driving the VW van earlier in the day and thought she was alone. Like maybe Peter had been in the back sleeping or something.
Okay.
And so they thought maybe Murdoch was actually just going after Joanne, and then Peter was like a oh shit kind of moment.
Yeah.
Another possible motive was that Murdoch was paranoid basically from all the drugs, and he was paranoid that Peter and Joanne were following him because between his drug use and the drugs he had on him at the time of the murder, he thought that they were like after him, I guess.
Sure.
Either one is a pretty good motive.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, you know.
Right. So in December of 2005, remember the trial started in October of 2005. So in December of 2005, Bradley John Murdoch was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Peter Falconio.
Good.
He also received 4 years in prison for deprivation of liberty of Joanne and 2 years for aggravated assault. And his sentence came with a non-parole period of 28 years. And this part is awesome. Get this. So apparently in Australia, at least in their Northern Territory, I don't know if it's like across the entire country, but in the Northern Territory, they have a law that if Murdoch doesn't tell the police where Peter's body is, he will never get parole, which I love that. No body, no parole.
Hell yes. Like
right?
We need to adopt that in the States. That is awesome.
Love that.
So many more people would have answers.
Absolutely. Exactly. Like, yep. I feel like that makes so much sense.
Yep. It's that easy.
So Murdoch tried to appeal his sentence a couple times, like once in 2007, it was denied, and again in 2014, that he withdrew. I didn't look into the reason why. He's a racist piece of crap, and he's a murderer. So I was like, your reason's probably stupid. I don't
Whatever
care.
it is.
Exactly. As for Joanne, I don't have a ton of information about her life since the trial, and I didn't honestly go digging. She's been through it. I do know that she returned to Australia on several occasions, and in 2017, she somehow, while over in Australia, she found out that she has a half-sister in Australia.
Shut up.
Yeah, they share a father, because Joanne was, like, estranged from her father.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right. So she found out she was a sister, so, like, if anything came out of this horrific case, like, that's pretty cool. Like, she was able to meet her half-sister, and she got, like, a whole family.
It's probably hard to put this behind you, but hopefully she uses that little tidbit as something about Australia that's positive.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I know for a little while there was reports about how she talked about how she wanted to get Australian citizenship so she could move there and like be near her paternal family.
Wow.
As of November 2023, she was living in the UK. She was working as a social worker. Because of time constraints, I really didn't get to talk about Peter's family, but they just seem so wonderful, so wholesome, so loving and supportive. And his mom has always gone on the record and been so supportive and like so full of love for Joanne, which is great.
Good.
Yeah. And that is the story of the murder of Peter Falconio and the connection to the 2005 horror film Wolf Creek.
Wow. Kudos to you, first of all, that's an awesome story. And I love the connection to it is literally Wolf Creek played out in real life.
Right?
But bravo for one, pronouncing everything correctly, I assume.
Yes,
I guess.
I hope. I started questioning myself halfway through and I was like, should I pause and look it up?
And two, for understanding like the figuring out at least the terminology and some of the way Australians do things in the legal system and the trial and stuff. So great job. That's an awesome story. I've only done one Australian case in my career, which I hope maybe we'll cover someday. I love it.
Yeah.
But I've always been fascinated by the outback, and I think I've never been there, but I just picture it as this like creepy, desolate wasteland where just like bad things can happen. And frankly, I'm surprised that we don't hear more stories like this, given that landscape out there. So
yeah, agreed.
Yeah. But let us know what you think, guys. Just about this theme, about the block, about the story. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to connect.
So you can find us on our socials, Facebook, Insta, TikTok, at Murder Unscripted. You can email us, murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on our website at www.murderunscriptedpod.com.
And if we have a weird amount of Australian followers, which one makes me wonder if I have a setting wrong on something.
Oh, yeah, I could see
like,
that.
why are so many people in Australia listening? But please let me know if koalas eat human beings.
Well, everyone, we hope you enjoyed this week. To our Australian listeners, you're awesome. Thank you for listening. And everyone, Australia, America, everywhere, everybody is perverts. So just remember, they don't always wear signs that say they're perverts.
Did you know that Australian, I looked this up specifically for this episode, they just call them pervs. There's no pervert, but it also means to look around like, I'm going to go perv at my buddy's car.
Stop. I'm going to start saying that. Going to perv out the window.
Stop perving out the window. You perv. I'm Rex Wild.